Hi everyone, I'm James Ryerson, and this is Line Edit, a video series about popular scholarly writing generously funded by the John Templeton Foundation. Who am I? I'm a newspaper and magazine editor. I've worked in the industry for about 20 years or so, at a variety of publications, but for the past 18 years or so I've been in one place, the New York Times, first at the Sunday Magazine, and now at the Opinion Pages. In each episode of Line Edit, I'll talk about my experience editing a specific piece by an academic I've worked with. These are short pieces written for wide audiences about the big questions. So in today's video, we're going to talk about a piece written by the philosopher Agnes Callard, published in the New York Times Opinion Pages, called Can We Learn to Believe in God? This piece appeared in the opinion section, but it also appeared in a sort of subsection of the opinion section called The Stone, which is a fairly long-running series of pieces by philosophers, both about philosophy and about the news of the day from the perspective of philosophers. Agnes has written many pieces now for the New York Times and elsewhere. This was her first published piece in the Times, published in January of 2018. If you want to learn about how Agnes got involved in doing more public writing as a philosopher, you should listen to the podcast interview that I did with Agnes as part of the Line Edit podcast series. In it, she talks not just about this particular piece and how it came to be, but much more generally and in a much more wide-ranging and fascinating way about her whole approach to public philosophy and indeed her skepticism sometimes about whether it's philosophy and whether it's even worthwhile. It's a true philosophical meditation on one academic's whole journey as a public academic. So I first came into contact with Agnes in a workshop that I was conducting in 2017 for academics looking to do more writing for the public. These workshops are funded, as are these videos and the Line Edit podcast series, by the John Templeton Foundation. If you'd like to hear the full story on what the workshops are and how they came to be, you can listen to the very first Line Edit podcast interview with Lisa Feldman Barrett. So in this workshop, when I first met Agnes, she brought this particular piece to be workshopped under the title Faith Without Self-Deception. And the original draft was over 8,000 words. She brought it in thinking of a longer magazine feature in mind. And the more she and I talked, the more I realized that I thought it could work in a much shorter form in the New York Times opinion pages, particularly in the Stone series. As it happened, I didn't end up editing the piece with Agnes. It wound up being edited by my colleague, Peter Catapano, a really wonderful and innovative editor who created the Stone series, among other things he's done at the Times. So in today's video, I'm going to talk about the piece from an editorial perspective, focusing on kind of a big picture issue, a kind of middle-sized issue in the editing, and a really small point in the editing as well. These aren't edits that I made myself in the sense that I wasn't, as I said, the actual kind of hands-on editor working with the kind of shorter version of the piece. So I'll refrain from pretending to know exactly what was going on in my colleague Peter's mind when he edited it. Instead, I'll keep myself to making points that really strike me as important editorial insights, just comparing the first draft to the final draft and seeing what can be learned in terms of where it began and where it ended up. The big picture point that I want to make when you just look at the first draft and the final published draft, or if you look at the first draft and you track the changes and you see exactly how much has been lost from the piece en route to its final version. The first and obvious thing to say is the first version of the piece was over 8,000 words, and the final published version of the piece was 1,400 words. And 1,400 words is still on the long side for an op-ed, but compared to an 8,000 plus word draft, it's a pretty radical change. And I think the big picture takeaway here, and I think it's especially useful for academics who are looking to write for a kind of wider audience and who are used to writing much, much longer pieces, books, chapters, articles, is that a piece can start out at pretty much any length, 20,000 words, 10,000 words, 5,000 words, 3,000 words, whatever length it starts out at, it can get shorter and shorter for publication as the space kind of demands. I've taken pieces that were drawn from books and run them as 800-word op-eds. I've taken 10,000 word magazine pieces and turn them into 3,000 word magazine pieces. What I always say when people say, well, how short can the piece get? I usually say it can get as short as you want it to get. It's just that along the way, it starts to become a kind of different piece. But particularly when it's an argumentative piece, when it's really based on an argument, as Agnes's piece is here, it really can operate at a pretty short level. It can be a very compressed schematic version of a book-length argument at 800 words, or it can be a slightly more developed version at 1400 words, or it can be, as in her first draft, a fairly sophisticated, somewhat meandering, multifaceted 8,000 word version of the piece. Don't get hung up on length. If you've got a long piece and you want to run it as an 8,000 word essay in the Atlantic magazine and they're not interested, that doesn't mean there's not going to be a home for it at 1,200 words somewhere else. And it doesn't mean that it can't actually be made to work at 1,200 words. Generally, if you're making an argument, it can be made to work at 800 words, 1,200 words, something in that ballpark. And I think the general lesson here is something like each piece is drawn from a population of pieces. You can find a version of your argument that still has integrity, that still has coherence, that still is recognizable to you as your argument at various different lengths. So the medium-sized point that I want to make here has to do with how Agnes begins the piece. It's slightly different in the original version at 8,000 plus words than it is in the published 1,400 word version, but it's basically the same in that she starts the piece with a quotation from the philosopher Pascal. Now, this is an interesting point because typically I would say the lesson is leave the epigraphs behind. Academics are used to beginning a piece either with an epigraph or starting just with a quotation. It's a standard academic move. Often academics are making their points in dialogue and conversation with other texts, and an argument is often situating itself by reference to other texts or taking its starting point from some locus classicus and the original text that started this argument. Those are all very common academic moves, and there's a lot of reasons why in an academic context that's the right thing to do. In journalistic context, I almost never allow writers to start a piece with a quotation, especially a quotation that's a couple hundred years old from a philosopher. It doesn't feel immediate. It doesn't feel like it's addressing a kind of issue that's current necessarily. It feels like we're back in school where what matters is what the text says, what the book says, as opposed to the pressing question. If the pressing question in Agnes's piece is, can you learn to believe in God? That's what we want to animate. We don't want to start talking about what some academic thought a couple hundred years ago or what some intellectual thought a couple hundred years ago. It just feels like you're not approaching the problem directly. So in general, my motto is leave the epigraphs behind or leave the epigraphs at home. So in this case, why does Agnes get away with it, and why does it work? In fact, I think it does work in this piece. And there are a couple things to say about that. One is a kind of more general point that academics should bear in mind about kind of venues for publishing your piece in newspapers and magazines. And that is that though the Washington Post or the Boston Globe or the New York Times are big general interest newspapers looking to reach a wide range of readers, they often have sections or designated columns that are more kind of welcome homes for academics. So the Washington Post has a made by history section where they do kind of opinion pieces largely by historians providing historical context. The Boston Globe has an ideas section, which is a kind of a weekly feature section that is particularly amenable to kind of stuff that might seem a little more academic than your usual opinion page fare. And the Times has had many different things like this in the opinion section while I've been there. And The Stone, Peter Catapano's series by philosophers, is another one of these. It's fairly long-standing. And if you're an academic who wants to write, it's worth being versant in what the venues are in different publications because it can often be a much more natural fit. There can be a lower barrier to entry. There can be an appetite for points that might seem a little too specialized or academic in other contexts. So in this case, I think part of the reason Agnes gets away with it is because she runs the piece in the Stone section of the New York Times. It's been around for a while. It's pretty well branded. It signals to people that it's a series by philosophers. So the fact that it's a little academic, one reason why I think she can get away with it. At the same time, I don't think that's the only reason she gets away with it. I think this could be seen profitably as an exception that proves the rule. The rule here being my general motto, leave the epigraphs at home. Why is this an exception? Agnes's whole piece is about whether or not believing in God makes sense if you think there's a pretty good chance that God doesn't exist. And how do you go about thinking about belief in God as a kind of statistical matter? What's the likelihood of it? And is it worth trying to believe in God and this sort of thing? That is the origin of that thought in philosophical discourse, in kind of, at least certainly in cultural literacy. The touchstone of that idea is Pascal's wager. So it's not like she's beginning with an academic quote to set the tone or to show that she is operating in a field of texts. She's really picking the classical example of this. And quite frankly, if you look at the first version of the piece, we get a lot of Pascal in his own words. And so I feel like the spirit of the motto, leave the epigraphs be home, is still honored, if not the exact letter of the law. The spirit of it is honored, and that we, in the Times, the version of this quotation is highly compressed, and you're just getting just enough to get a taste of the original powerful Pascal thought. And once you get it, you're quickly in the realm of Agnes, and she starts talking about it and revivifying it and making it her own, complexifying it, and making it do her work rather than just being something that she's citing. That would be the kind of mid-sized point I'd like to make about the edit. The third and final point I want to make about the editing of the piece is really small, but I think it speaks to a couple different things that are relevant when academics are looking to do this kind of writing. And that is the title of the piece, or what we call in the journalism newspaper business, the headline. The title in the version that Agnes originally brought to the workshop was Faith Without Self-Deception. And the title that the piece ultimately runs with, to remind you, is Can We Learn to Believe in God? I want to talk about a few considerations and factors that go into why this title or headline is changed from one thing to another. I think the first, almost prosaic but really important to know kind of thing, if you're writing like this for the first time as an academic, is that the convention in journalism is that writers don't get to pick their titles. They don't get to pick the headline. That is the prerogative of the editor of the publication. The reasons for that are probably not super germane here. Briefly, it has to do with wanting to make sure that editors can control the overall kind of tone and packaging and kind of approach of the work that they publish. And obviously they do that to some extent through selection of pieces and editing of pieces, but the kind of most important kind of marketing packaging type decision they can make is what to call the piece. A lot of publications have their personality through the kind of style of headline that they favor. The New Republic in the 90s and the early aughts had a very distinctive style where the headlines were very clever and punny most of the time. The BuzzFeed really became famous for a certain kind of very kind of catchy, come on, clickbaity kind of headline. And so publications often have a sensibility that's often filtered through their headlines. So editors are often pretty particular about what they call pieces. So it's important to know that, because a lot of people publish a piece and it's published with a different headline than they would have imagined, and they're taken aback. So it's useful just to know that's something you don't have control over. But control is probably not the most important thing to say here. Why does it go from faith without self-deception to can we learn to believe in God? There's two considerations, and one is a little bit of a kind of contingent historical fact about what headlines are like today in a world where people are reading more and more, perhaps predominantly, perhaps almost exclusively online as opposed to in print. And that is, as I said, a contingent kind of reason, which is that now that headlines often appear in news feeds or on home pages or in emails that have been forwarded to you, so on and so forth, without the accompanying text right next to it, without the art often that helps communicate what the piece is about, without everything, the pull quotes, without everything that goes into the traditional display of a print piece, without everything there, when you're just left with a headline, there's a lot of pressure on the headline to stand on its own, as it were, to communicate as much about the piece on its own as it can without the sort of sub-headline or anything like that. And so with that pressure, you often find the resulting forms are questions, more provocative statements, often more colloquial sounding language, and questions, rhetorical questions, or questions that are simply asked are very common. So can we learn to believe in God? If you see that headline, you immediately have some sense of what's being asked. Can we learn to believe in God? Is that something that we can learn to do? Is that something that just has to happen all at once as a kind of revelation? You immediately have some sense of what the question might mean. Whereas Agnes's original title, Faith Without Self-Deception, it's a little, what we say in the news business, it's a little blind. You don't quite know what's being asked. For instance, faith. Do we usually think faith involves self-deception? I don't know. I don't think that's something that we associate with faith. So faith without self-deception, It's just unclear what the opposition is supposed to be. Now, if this was the title of a paper for an academic journal, this might be a very successful headline. Faith Without Self-Deception actually captures very much the core concepts in the piece. But again, this is not an academic paper, so something like "Can we learn to believe in God" is much more engaging in the sense that you are immediately drawn in. You may not be interested in that question, but if you are, that this is an article that addresses it. So the final thing to say here about headlines, as I mentioned, you don't really get the say as the writer of what the headline is. That's something that the editor decides. So you might even think that you could submit the piece without a headline, and it's perfectly fine. I get many pieces to me submitted without a title or a headline, and I'm happy to read the piece and come up with my own headline. So that's fine. But an interesting thing about these kind of digital headlines that we were talking about, these kind of standalone headlines, "Can we learn to believe in God?" Something that can engage you without really any other information. What's interesting about them is that it's not a bad exercise when you're writing a piece and you're submitting it to an editor to try to come up with a headline like that, to try to come up with a title or headline that does as much of the kind of work of engaging the reader as possible. Why do you want to do that? Maybe it will become the actual headline of the piece, and you impress the editor with your ability to come up with a headline like this, and that's great. You end up having control over the headline after all. Another reason is that even if that's not the headline that you end up having as the ultimate headline on your piece, the very first reader of your piece is the editor. Before it's promoted on the homepage of a newspaper, or whether it's before it's in someone's Twitter feed or anywhere else, the first person that you're really trying to grab is the editor. So if I open a draft that's been submitted to me and the title is "Faith Without Self-Deception," I'm not really that interested. I got to start reading the piece to find out if I'm interested. If you submit a piece to me like this, and the title is "Can We Learn to Believe in God?" I'm at least oriented with respect to the piece. I'm a little bit more engaged than maybe I would otherwise be. I don't think it's a game changer, but I think it's not a bad exercise. It can only help you engage your editor as a reader more quickly. And if you're lucky, it might even become the final headline of the piece. Thanks again for joining us for Line Edit. We're very grateful to the public engagement team at the John Templeton Foundation, who made this project and its associated podcasts possible. Thanks as well to Dave DeSteno and Lisa Feldman Barrett, professors at Northeastern University, which administers our grant. And of course, we couldn't have done this without the generosity of Agnes Callard, who graciously allowed us to look under the microscope at her first draft, as well as the final product. This video is hosted and produced by me, James Ryerson, and produced and edited by Joseph Friedman. Happy writing.